Welcome! Settle in, get comfortable, and let the world outside go quiet for a little while. Tonight, we're going somewhere extraordinary, a place so small you could drive from one end to the other in under an hour, and yet a place that may be the most fought over, most strategically vital patch of land in the history of Western civilization. We are going to Malta. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to travel more than 7,000 years into the past, moving through civilizations that rose and fell like tides against these limestone cliffs. We will walk through temples older than Stonehenge, stand inside harbours that launched the fleets of Phoenicia, Carthage, Rome, the Crusaders, Napoleon, and the British Empire. We will witness sieges that shook the entire Mediterranean world, battles so fierce, so sustained, so brutal that historians still marvel at how the island endured. And we will ask the one question that unites all of these stories. What was it about this little island that made every great empire on earth want to possess it? This is a sleep story, which means we will move at a gentle, immersive pace. But do not let that fool you into thinking it will be a quiet or uneventful journey. History rarely is. The story of Malta is full of mystery, of violence, of extraordinary human courage, of civilizations that vanished without explanation, of monks who became warriors, of farmers who defied an empire, of a people who were bombed so relentlessly during the Second World War that the entire nation was awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian honour in the British Empire. Malta's story is the story of the Mediterranean itself, and the Mediterranean for most of recorded human history was the centre of the world. So let us begin at the beginning, or as close to it as we can get. Imagine, for a moment, that you are floating above the Mediterranean Sea. Not the modern Mediterranean, busy with tankers and cruise ships and container vessels, but an ancient Mediterranean, a sea without maps, without lighthouses, without any name that we would recognise. You are looking down at a great inland sea, shaped something like a long, narrow corridor, almost 3,000 kilometres from Gibraltar in the west to the Levantine coast in the east, and no more than a few hundred kilometres wide in most places. It is a sea enclosed almost entirely by land. Europe to the north, Africa to the south, and Asia Minor to the east. And somewhere in the very middle, not quite at the centre, but close enough to feel like the heart of the whole system, there is a small cluster of islands. That cluster is what we now call Malta. 3 main islands, Malta itself, Gozo, and a tiny sliver called Comino in between. Together they cover an area of about 316 square kilometres. In a world of continents and great nations, that is nothing. A dot, a pinprick, something you could miss on a map if you blinked, and yet these 300 square kilometres sat at the precise junction where the eastern Mediterranean meets the western Mediterranean, where the shipping lanes from the Levant and Egypt met the routes heading toward Carthage, Sicily, Spain, and the open Atlantic. The island of Malta itself is shaped a little like a fish, broader at the southeast, narrowing toward the northwest, and it sits roughly 90 kilometres south of Sicily and about 300 kilometres north of the Libyan coast. Those numbers matter. 90 kilometres from Sicily meant that any fleet controlling Malta could threaten or support Sicily, the great grain basket of the ancient world. 300 kilometres from North Africa meant that Malta was close enough to Africa to be useful as a stepping stone, but far enough away to be defensible, and the harbours were extraordinary. The northeastern coast of Malta, particularly the area around what is now the grand harbour of Valletta, presented a deep, naturally protected anchorage of such quality that sailors recognised its value from the very first moment they saw it. The limestone headlands sheltered the inner harbour from the prevailing northwestern winds. The water was deep enough for large vessels, and there were multiple bays and inlets that could be defended from the land with relative ease. For any civilization that depended on maritime trade or military projection across the Mediterranean, Malta was not merely useful, it was something close to essential. Control Malta, and you controlled the corridor between east and west. Control the corridor, and you controlled the flow of wealth, grain, timber, metals, spices, soldiers, and information across the ancient world. This is why empires fought for it. This is why, over the course of 7,000 years, Malta changed hands more times than almost any other piece of land on Earth, and why each civilization that possessed it left some permanent mark on the stone, the language, the DNA, and the soul of the Maltese people. Before we follow the full arc of Malta's human story, it is worth dwelling a moment longer on the Mediterranean itself, on what this sea meant to the civilizations that grew up around it, and why mastery of its waters translated so directly into mastery of the ancient world's wealth and power. The Mediterranean was, in the most literal sense, the engine of Western civilization. Its enclosed geography, almost no tides, generally moderate storms outside of specific seasons, a regular wind system that skilled sailors could predict and use, made it the most navigable and most intensively used body of water in the world for most of recorded history. Cities grew up on its shores not primarily because of the agricultural land behind them, but because of the sea in front of them, the access to trade, to information, to the materials and foodstuffs that no single region could produce in sufficient quantity for itself. The grain of Egypt and Sicily fed Rome. The timber of Lebanon built the ships of Phoenicia. The silver of Spain funded the armies of Carthage. The silk of China arrived in Constantinople through routes that crossed Persian and Arab middlemen, and then crossed this sea. The spices of the East Indies reached the kitchens of Florence and Lyon and London via Alexandria and Venice and Genoa. The philosophical ideas of Athens were carried to Alexandria, and then to Rome, and then to the Arab world, and then back to a medieval Europe that had forgotten most of them. The religious revelations of the Levant, Jewish monotheism, Christian redemption, Islamic submission, spread around the shores of this sea with a speed and thoroughness that no other body of water could have matched, carried by the same ships that carried grain and marble and human slaves and the correspondence of merchants. To control this sea, or even to exercise significant influence over its central passages, was to sit at the counting house of the world. The tolls collected on trade, the ability to deny passage to rivals, the power to project military force anywhere along the enormous coastline that the sea bordered, these were not merely local or regional advantages. They were the mechanisms of world power as it existed before the oceanic age that would begin in the late 15th century, with the European voyages to the Americas and around Africa to Asia. And in this sea, Malta occupied a position of unique structural importance. You could sail around Malta. There were routes through the Mediterranean that did not require approaching the Maltese islands, but they were longer, more dangerous, and less efficient. The Central Passage, the direct route between east and west, ran through the narrows between Malta and Sicily, and any civilization that controlled those narrows could impose its will on that traffic. This is why the island's history is, in miniature, the history of Mediterranean power. Whoever ruled the Mediterranean world in any given era also ruled Malta, or was trying to. But before any of the great empires arrived, before the Phoenicians or the Romans or the Knights of St. John, there were the first people, a civilization so ancient, so sophisticated, and so utterly mysterious that we do not even know what they called themselves. We do not know their language. We do not know where they went or how they vanished. We only know what they left behind, and what they left behind is among the most astonishing evidence of early human civilization anywhere in the world. Somewhere around 5,900 years before the birth of Christ, roughly 7,500 years ago, the first human beings arrived on the island of Malta. They came almost certainly from Sicily, probably crossing the 90-kilometre strait in simple boats, bringing with them their domesticated animals, their seeds, their pottery styles, and whatever beliefs and customs had shaped their lives on the mainland. These were Neolithic farmers, part of the great wave of agricultural peoples who spread across the Mediterranean basin after the invention of farming in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. They settled, they farmed the thin limestone soil, they fished the surrounding waters, and for the next several thousand years they built a civilization whose full nature we are still trying to understand. For a long time, the story of these early Maltese people was told as a simple prologue, a few lines about prehistoric farmers before the real history began with the Phoenicians or the Romans. But then, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists began to excavate sites scattered across both Malta and Gozo, and what they found utterly changed the picture. They found temples, not just one or two, but more than 20 monumental stone temple complexes, spread across both islands, built from massive blocks of coralline, limestone, some of which weighed over 50 tons. These temples were not rough or primitive. They were architecturally sophisticated, featuring curved apse chambers, decorated altars, thresholds of finely worked stone, and a level of geometric planning that indicated generations of accumulated knowledge and tradition. The most famous of these sites is Gantiger on the island of Gozo, which gives its name to the entire period of Maltese prehistory known as the Gantiger phase, dating from roughly 3600 to 3200 BCE. The name itself in Maltese means belonging to the giantess, because later generations of Maltese, arriving at the site centuries or millennia after its abandonment, could not believe that ordinary human beings had built something so enormous. They invented legends that the temples were the work of a giant female deity, a giantess who carried the stones on her head and nursed her child at the same time, building the structure in a single day. It is a beautiful legend, and it tells us something important, that the temples were already ancient and mysterious to the people who came after, already stripped of their original meaning, already part of the deep, half-forgotten past. The reality of how those stones were moved is no less remarkable than the legend. Archaeologists believe the builders used a system of stone balls, rounded limestone spheres discovered in large quantities near the temples, as rollers beneath the great blocks. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people working together over generations, quarrying the stone, shaping it with harder stone tools, rolling it across the landscape, and assembling it with a precision that is still visible today. The temples at Gantiger have survived 5,500 years remarkably intact. Their trefoil ground plans, their niched inner chambers, their massive threshold stones, all still recognizable and still standing, making them the oldest freestanding stone structures on the surface of the planet Earth. The pyramids at Giza were built roughly 1,000 years after Gantiger. Stonehenge was being planned around the same time. But in terms of surviving architectural monuments, these Maltese temples hold the record for age. What were they used for? This question has fascinated and frustrated archaeologists for over a century. The temples do not appear to have been used for human habitation. They were not houses or palaces. They were ritual spaces, almost certainly connected to a religious or ceremonial life of great complexity. Inside the temples, archaeologists have found animal bones, the remains of animal sacrifices, as well as small figurines, altars with traces of fire, and carved decorations that may represent plants, animals, or the stylized shapes of the natural world. The temple entrances are often oriented towards significant solar events, the rising or setting sun at the solstices or equinoxes, suggesting an astronomical awareness and a religious calendar tied to the cycles of the year. What is most extraordinary is the sheer number and scale of these temples relative to the small size of the islands and the estimated population. By the peak of the temple period, roughly 3,000 to 2,500 BCE, scholars estimate that Malta and Gozo supported a population of perhaps 10 to 20,000 people. For that smaller population to have invested so massively in monumental religious architecture speaks to a society in which the temples were the absolute centre of social, political and spiritual life, a theocratic community, organised around the demands of religion, in which the building and maintenance of the sacred spaces was the primary purpose of collective effort. And then there is the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum. No single site in Malta, and perhaps no single site in the entire prehistoric Mediterranean, is more haunting or more difficult to explain than the Hypogeum. Discovered accidentally in 1902 when workers drilling, a cistern broke through its roof. The Hypogeum is an entirely underground complex, a series of chambers, corridors and ritual spaces carved directly into the living rock of the earth, descending through 3 levels to a depth of 11 metres below the surface. It was created over a period of roughly 1,000 years, from about 3,300 to 2,500 BCE, expanding organically as the needs of its builders grew. The craftsmanship inside the Hypogeum is almost impossible to credit when you stand within it. The builders had only stone, bone and antler tools, no metals of any kind, and yet they carved chambers with corbelled ceilings so perfectly shaped that they echo sound in extraordinary ways. The room known as the Oracle Chamber has an acoustic property that has been the subject of serious scientific study. When a low-pitched male voice speaks or chants inside it, the sound resonates and reverberates through the surrounding rock in a way that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves, from the floor, from the ceiling. This cannot be accidental. The geometry of the chamber is too precise, the effect too dramatic to be a matter of chance. The builders of the Hypogeum understood resonance and acoustics, and they deliberately engineered a space in which certain sounds would produce a specific, probably overwhelming sensory experience. The acoustic properties of the hypogeum deserve more than a passing mention, because they take us into a dimension of prehistoric culture that most accounts of ancient history tend to ignore. The dimension of sound, of music, of the deliberate manipulation of sensory experience as a religious act. Researchers from the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and from various European universities have measured and mapped the acoustic phenomena of the oracle chamber with modern equipment, and found that the resonance frequency of the room, approximately 110 Hz, falls within the range of a baritone male voice and corresponds to a brainwave frequency that neuroscience has associated with states of altered consciousness, reduced critical thinking, heightened emotional responsiveness, and increased tendency towards suggestibility and visionary experience. In other words, if a priest or ritual specialist chanted in this chamber at the right pitch, the room itself would have worked on the minds and bodies of anyone listening in ways that would have felt, to a Neolithic worshipper with no scientific framework to understand them, like something very close to the voice of the divine. This is not mysticism or speculation dressed up as archaeology. It is a measurable physical phenomenon in a deliberately designed architectural space, which tells us that the people who built the hypogeum possessed not only the engineering skills to cut these chambers from solid rock with tools of stone and bone, but also a sophisticated understanding of how sound behaves in enclosed spaces and how that sound behaviour affects human psychology. They were, in the fullest sense, architects of experience, people who thought carefully about how to shape the world around a worshipper in order to produce a specific internal state. The hypogeum also contains, on some of its walls, traces of red ochre painting, spirals and geometric forms that are among the oldest surviving examples of cave painting in the Mediterranean region. These images, faded and fragmentary now, connect the Maltese temple builders to a wider tradition of prehistoric art that stretches from the cave paintings of Altamira and Lascaux in Western Europe to the rock art of Saharan Africa and the painted caves of Sulawesi in Indonesia. The urge to mark stone with images, to leave some visible trace of interior life on the material world, appears to be as old as human consciousness itself, and in the hypogeum it persists in the darkness, far below the surface, in a space where the dead were laid to rest and the voice of the divine was heard in the resonant rock. When you emerge from the hypogeum into the bright Mediterranean light after visiting, and the visit is carefully controlled, limited to a small number of people per day, because the humidity and carbon dioxide from human breath are gradually eroding the ancient surfaces, you carry with you a feeling that is difficult to name precisely. It is not quite awe, not quite fear, not quite sadness. It is something closer to the feeling of having been in the presence of something that precedes all the categories through which we normally interpret experience, older than religion as we understand it, older than philosophy, older than history. The people who built and used and were buried in the hypogeum were fully human in every biological and cognitive sense, and yet they inhabited a mental world so different from ours that we can barely even formulate the questions that would help us understand it. What kind of experience did the oracle chamber create? Perhaps the oracle chamber was used exactly as its name suggests, a place where a priest or priestess could speak in the voice of a god, the sound seeming to emerge from the rock itself, from the belly of the earth. Perhaps it was a place of healing, of meditation, of initiation. What we know for certain is that the hypogeum was also used as a collective burial site of extraordinary scale. The remains of approximately 7,000 individuals have been recovered from its chambers, men, women and children from different periods of the temple culture's existence, interred within the sacred underground space alongside ritual objects, animal bones and personal adornments. Among the most significant objects found in the hypogeum is the small clay figurine known as the Sleeping Lady, a reclining female figure, barely 12 centimetres long, depicted lying on her side in what appears to be deep sleep or trance. The figurine is one of the masterpieces of prehistoric art anywhere in the world, not because of its size, but because of its extraordinary realism and expressiveness. The Sleeping Lady looks utterly peaceful, utterly absorbed in whatever inner world she inhabits, and she has been interpreted variously as a goddess, a priestess in a state of ritual incubation, the practice of sleeping in a sacred space in order to receive divine dreams or visions, or simply as a representation of the eternal state of rest that awaits the dead. She now sits in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, where she has been for over a century, and she still arrests every visitor who sees her with the strange, impossible feeling that she's about to wake up. That is the gift and the torment of Malta's prehistory. It is close enough in time and in physical space. You can drive to Halsaflieni in 20 minutes from Valletta to feel almost accessible, and yet it remains fundamentally opaque, a world whose meaning was lost completely when its people disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the stones and the bones and the beautiful, sleeping clay figure of a woman dreaming in the dark. And then, sometime around 2500 BCE, possibly a little before, possibly a little after, the temple culture ended. It did not transition gradually into something else. It did not evolve or adapt or merge with incoming populations. It simply stopped. The temples were abandoned. The hypogeum fell silent. The fires on the altars went out, and the great communal project that had defined Maltese society for more than 3,000 years simply ceased to exist. The population seems to have collapsed dramatically, whether through disease, environmental degradation, drought, resource depletion, social collapse, or some combination of all of these. We do not know. When new people arrived in Malta sometime after 2500 BCE, bringing with them the knowledge of bronze, the old temples were already ruins, already being reclaimed by the Mediterranean scrubland, already entering the realm of legend. For thousands of years the temples would sit silent and largely forgotten, visited occasionally by curious travellers, but understood by no one. It would take the science of modern archaeology to begin to recover their story, and even now that story is far from complete. The temple builders left no written records, no inscriptions, no names. They are among the most enigmatic peoples in human history, and Malta is the canvas on which they painted their mystery. The Bronze Age populations who followed the collapse of the temple culture in Malta were a transitional people. We know relatively little about them, but by around 800 to 700 BCE, a new and very different kind of civilization had begun to take an interest in the island. These were the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were among the most remarkable people of the ancient world, and they are also among the least celebrated in popular history, overshadowed by the Greeks and Romans who came after them, and who wrote most of the history that has survived. The Phoenicians originated in the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Berytus, and they were, above all else, traders. Extraordinary traders. Fearless sailors who pushed further and further into the unknown Western Mediterranean in search of markets, resources and opportunities, establishing a network of trading posts and colonies that eventually stretched from the Levantine coast all the way to the Atlantic, coast of Spain and Morocco. The Phoenician trading network was built on a simple but powerful logic. They controlled the production and distribution of a few extraordinarily valuable commodities, above all purple dye, glass, cedar wood, and finished metalwork, and they used these commodities to establish exchange relationships with peoples across the entire Mediterranean world. They were not empire builders in the conventional sense. They did not seek to conquer and administer large territories. They sought instead to establish secure way stations, harbours and trading posts at strategic intervals along the sea routes, places where their ships could take on provisions, offload goods, do business, and shelter from storms. Malta was perfectly positioned to be exactly such a way station. When Phoenician traders or explorers first rounded the coast of Sicily and pushed south across the Channel toward Africa, they would have seen the Maltese islands rising from the sea, limestone cliffs topped with scrubland, the sun glinting off the pale rock, the natural harbours opening like arms in welcome. For sailors who had just crossed 90 kilometres of open water, Malta was salvation. For merchants seeking a midpoint between the eastern Mediterranean and the western trade routes, Malta was a gift. The Phoenicians named the island Maleth, or possibly Mala. The exact etymology is disputed, but the most commonly accepted interpretation connects the name to the Semitic root for refuge or shelter, which is entirely appropriate given the island's natural harbour. This name would persist through centuries and multiple languages, evolving through the Greek Melite, the Latin Melita, and eventually the modern Malta, a linguistic thread connecting the modern island to its Phoenician founders across nearly 3,000 years. The Phoenician presence on Malta was more than just occasional. They established a genuine colony, possibly as early as the 8th century BCE. Archaeological evidence, including Phoenician inscriptions, ceramics, jewellery and small religious objects, has been found at multiple sites across the islands. The most significant of these inscriptions is the famous Sippus of Malta, a limestone block discovered in the 16th century CE that bore a bilingual dedication in both Phoenician and Greek, which proved invaluable to 19th century scholars trying to decipher the Phoenician script, playing a role in that language's decipherment not entirely unlike the role the Rosetta Stone played in Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Phoenicians brought to Malta not just trade, but a whole cultural framework. They built temples to their own gods, primarily Baal and Astarte, the great divine couple of the Phoenician world, and they established the social and commercial infrastructure that would define the island's character for centuries. Most importantly, they recognized the strategic value of the Grand Harbour and began to develop it as a serious maritime facility, not just a casual anchorage, but a properly organized port capable of servicing the increasingly large merchant fleets that were crossing the Mediterranean. For the Phoenicians, Malta was what geographers sometimes call a gateway, a place whose value derives almost entirely from its position at the junction of two or more major routes or regions. You could not easily sail from the Phoenician home ports in the Levant to Carthage, or from Carthage to the Phoenician colonies in Spain, without either stopping at Malta or accepting a significantly more dangerous and difficult sea voyage. The island was, in the truest sense, unavoidable. And because it was unavoidable, whoever controlled it controlled the passage of everything that moved between east and west. This insight, that Malta was not just useful but structurally necessary to Mediterranean commerce and military power, is the central insight that would recur again and again across the island's history. Every civilization that came after the Phoenicians would arrive at the same conclusion by a slightly different route, and every civilization would compete, sometimes desperately, to secure this conclusion for themselves. What the Phoenicians left behind in Malta went deeper than harbour installations and trade routes. They left behind something more intimate and more lasting, a way of understanding the sea. The Maltese relationship with the Mediterranean, the particular intimacy with its moods and currents and dangers, the practical fluency with boats and tides, and the reed of the horizon that runs like a thread through Maltese culture across millennia, has its roots in the Phoenician era. The Phoenicians were the greatest sailors of the ancient world before the Greeks, and possibly the greatest navigators of all, the first people to sail by the stars rather than by the coastline, the first to push through the Pillars of Hercules and navigate the Atlantic coast of Africa and possibly Europe. What they understood about the sea, the way weather builds from the northwest in autumn, the way the summer sirocco blows up from Africa hot and carrying sand, the way the currents run through the channels between the islands, the way the Grand Harbour's entrance can appear deceptively narrow from certain angles and deceptively wide from others. All of this knowledge was transmitted into the culture of the people who stayed on the island when the Phoenician trading networks moved on, the people who became Carthaginian Maltese and then Roman Maltese, and then Arab Maltese, and then Norman Maltese, and then, eventually, simply Maltese. The knowledge of the sea cannot be easily separated from the knowledge of the island itself, and both of them have roots that reach back to the Phoenician presence and beyond it into the even deeper past of the Bronze Age peoples who preceded them. The Phoenicians held Malta peacefully, or at least without recorded conflict, for several centuries, but their power was ebbing. The great Phoenician cities of the Levant were being absorbed into the empires of Assyria and later Persia, and the centre of Phoenician civilization in the west was shifting decisively toward Carthage, the great city-state on the coast of what is now Tunisia, which had been founded as a Phoenician colony, but had grown into something far more powerful and independent than its parent civilization. By around 600 BCE, Malta had passed, without any dramatic break, from Phoenician into Carthaginian influence. Carthage, Kart Hadasht in Phoenician, meaning new city, was by this point the dominant maritime power in the Western Mediterranean, a city of perhaps 300,000 people, the greatest city in the non-Greek world, with a commercial network that stretched from the coast of West Africa to the tin mines of Cornwall. Carthaginian merchants were the invisible hands that moved the wealth of the Western world, and Carthaginian admirals commanded the largest and most experienced naval force in the Mediterranean west of Greece. For Carthage, Malta was not merely a convenient waypoint, but a strategic military asset of the first importance. The island's position meant that a Carthaginian fleet based at Malta could interdict virtually any attempt by a rival power to move ships between the eastern and western Mediterranean. It could threaten Sicily, which Carthage and the Greek city-states of Syracuse and Acragas were perpetually fighting over, from the south. It could protect the sea lanes between Carthage's home port in Tunisia and its western colonies in Spain, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. And it was close enough to Carthage itself, roughly 300 kilometres, that reinforcements could be sent quickly if the island came under threat. The Carthaginian period on Malta lasted roughly 400 years, from about 600 to 218 BCE, and during this time, the island was thoroughly integrated into the Carthaginian world. The population spoke a Semitic language closely related to Punic, the Carthaginian dialect of Phoenician, and this linguistic inheritance is visible in Malta to this day, because the Maltese language, uniquely among the languages of Europe, is a Semitic language written in the Latin alphabet, a direct descendant of the Punic spoken on the island during the Carthaginian era, layered with later Arabic, Italian and English borrowings. When you hear Maltese spoken today, and it sounds like nothing else in Europe, guttural and melodious at the same time, full of sounds that belong to the Arabic family, you're hearing an echo of Carthage. The Carthaginians built and expanded the harbour facilities at Malta with serious military intent. The island's natural harbours were shaped and deepened, and the strategic headlands were fortified. Malta became, in effect, a forward base for Carthaginian naval operations in the central Mediterranean, a place where ships could be resupplied, repaired, and prepared for battle, and where a garrison could deny the island's facilities to any rival. The crisis that would end Carthaginian Malta came with the Punic Wars, the series of 3 titanic conflicts between Carthage and the rising power of Rome that dominated the western Mediterranean between 264 and 146 BCE. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BCE, was triggered by a dispute over Sicily, but it quickly became a struggle for mastery of the entire western Mediterranean. Rome, which had until then been primarily a land power, was forced to build a navy from scratch, allegedly using a beached Carthaginian warship as a template, and to learn the art of naval warfare at extraordinary speed and at extraordinary cost in lives and ships. During the opening phases of the First Punic War, Malta became directly significant. A Roman fleet under the consul Marcus Attilius Regulus pushed south from Sicily in 256 BCE as part of a bold and ultimately catastrophic attempt to invade Africa directly, striking at Carthage's home territory. This fleet passed through Maltese waters, and there are accounts, though they come to us through later, not entirely reliable sources, of the Maltese islands being used or contested during this period. What is certain is that when the war eventually ended with Rome in possession of Sicily, Malta's position as a Carthaginian outpost became untenable. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began, the conflict that would bring Hannibal across the Alps and to the very gates of Rome, and that would determine once and for all which civilization would dominate the western Mediterranean. Early in this war, in 218 BCE, a Roman praetor named Titus Sempronius Longus led a naval expedition that captured Malta and Gozo from their Carthaginian garrison. The handover, according to the ancient sources, was accomplished with relatively little violence. The Carthaginian commander recognized the military reality and surrendered the islands rather than defend them to the last. This practical, unsentimental calculation would be repeated many times in Malta's future, and so Malta became Roman. The Romans came to Malta as conquerors, but they stayed as admirers. The island's Semitic-speaking population, whose language and culture were rooted in centuries of Phoenician and Carthaginian influence, were absorbed into the Roman world with what appears to have been relatively little friction. The Romans called the island Melita, adapting the Punic and Greek names, and they governed it initially as part of the province of Sicily, but the island enjoyed a privileged status from early on. Why did the Romans love Malta? Partly for the same strategic reasons that had drawn every civilization before them: the harbours, the position, the utility as a naval base and commercial waypoint. But the Romans also appreciated Malta for something more specific: its textile industry. Maltese fabric, particularly a fine linen and a variety of cloth made from the silk of a local marine organism called Pinna nobilis, the noble pen shell, was renowned throughout the Roman world for its quality and beauty. Cicero, who governed Sicily in the 1st century BCE and had extensive dealings with Maltese affairs, described Maltese cloth in terms that suggest it was considered a luxury product, a gift fit for aristocrats and emperors. What did daily life actually look like in Roman Malta? The evidence, while fragmentary, allows us to sketch a picture of surprising sophistication and cosmopolitan variety. The harbour quarter of Melita, centred around the excellent natural anchorage of what is now Marsamxett Harbour and the smaller creek harbours to the south, would have been a busy, noisy, multilingual place during the peak trading seasons of spring and summer. Ships from Alexandria would have unloaded papyrus, glass, Egyptian grain, and luxury goods from the eastern trade. Vessels from Sicily brought wine, olive oil, and refined manufactured goods. North African traders arrived with hides, animals, and agricultural products from the deep interior. In the other direction, Maltese woven cloth, that famous luxury fabric for which the island was renowned across the Roman world, was being packed into bales and loaded onto ships bound for Rome, Carthage, Antioch, and beyond. The Roman villa at Rabat, excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries, and now partially open to visitors, gives us our most tangible domestic glimpse of Roman Malta. The villa was a substantial structure, a wealthy household, probably that of a Roman administrator or a successful local merchant who had achieved Roman citizenship, featuring mosaic floors, painted walls, a peristyle garden, and all the standard amenities of comfortable Roman provincial life. The mosaics, though damaged, still show the quality of craftsmanship, available in Malta during the Roman period. Mythological scenes, geometric patterns, and the kinds of marine imagery, fish, dolphins, sea creatures, that would have been entirely natural in a society oriented so fundamentally toward the sea. Roman Malta was also a place of religious complexity and layering, in the way of all Roman provinces, where official Roman religion coexisted with local traditions and with the cosmopolitan mix of cults and beliefs that followed trade routes across the empire. The old Phoenician deities, Baal, Astarte, Melkart, were not immediately displaced by Roman worship. They were often assimilated into the Roman pantheon, Astarte becoming identified with Venus, Baal with Saturn, Melkart with Hercules. This syncretism was entirely characteristic of Roman religious practice, which was generally tolerant of local traditions as long as they did not threaten public order or the fundamental loyalty of provincials to the imperial system. The Roman period transformed Malta physically. The great harbour area was developed into a proper Roman port, with warehouses, market buildings, and administrative facilities. Villas were built across the islands, several of which have been excavated and can be visited today. The population adopted Latin alongside their existing Semitic dialect, and Roman gods entered the local religious landscape alongside the older Phoenician ones. The island became, in the way of Roman provinces at their best, a genuinely cosmopolitan place, a Mediterranean crossroads where merchants, soldiers, sailors, administrators, and travellers from across the empire mingled, traded, gossiped, and occasionally stayed. It was during the Roman period, specifically in the autumn of the year 60 CE, by the most commonly accepted modern reckoning, though ancient sources give different dates, that Malta received the most famous involuntary visitor in its history. His name was Paul of Tarsus. He was a Jewish tent maker and scholar from Cilicia who had experienced a dramatic religious conversion on the road to Damascus some 30 years earlier, and who had since then travelled extensively across the eastern Mediterranean, preaching a new faith built on the teachings of a Jewish carpenter from Galilee named Jesus. Paul was, by 60 CE, both the most effective missionary of the early Christianity and a prisoner of Rome. He had appealed to Caesar after being arrested in Jerusalem, and was being transported by ship to Rome to stand trial, in the company of Roman soldiers and a centurion named Julius. The ship that carried Paul was a large grain freighter, the ancient Mediterranean's equivalent of a bulk carrier, making the late-season crossing from Alexandria to Rome. Ancient mariners knew that the Mediterranean became dangerous after September, when the prevailing winds shifted and storms became more frequent and more severe. Paul himself reportedly warned the ship's captain and the Roman officials that the voyage was ill-timed, but his advice was ignored. The ship left the harbour of Fair Havens on Crete and pushed west, and almost immediately ran into trouble. A violent northeastern wind, the ancient mariners called it the Euraquilo, caught the vessel and drove it helplessly westward for 14 days, the crew unable to steer, the passengers terrified, the ship's cargo jettisoned in a desperate attempt to keep afloat. On the 14th night, the sailors measured the depth of the water and realized they were approaching land. Rocky, treacherous land, invisible in the darkness. They dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When dawn came, they saw a bay with a beach where they might be able to run the ship aground without it breaking apart immediately. They cut the anchors, raised what remained of the sails, and drove the ship toward the shore. The bow stuck in the sand and held. The stern began to break up under the force of the waves. The 276 people on board reached the shore, some swimming, some clinging to planks and pieces of the ship's wreckage. All of them survived. The bay where they landed is called to this day St. Paul's Bay, San Paul il Bahar in Maltese, on the northwestern coast of Malta. And the story of what happened next is told in the Acts of the Apostles, written by the physician Luke, with a directness and specificity that historians have often noted as a mark of eyewitness or near-eyewitness reporting. The local people, Luke calls them the barbarians, using the Greek term simply to mean non-Greek speakers, not as a term of contempt, built a fire on the beach and welcomed the shipwrecked travellers with warmth and hospitality. Paul gathered sticks for the fire, and as he did so, a viper came out from the bundle of wood, perhaps awakened by the warmth, and fastened itself to his hand. The islanders, observing this, whispered among themselves that this man must be a murderer, that justice was pursuing him even after he had survived the sea. They waited for him to swell up and fall dead. He didn't. He shook the snake off into the fire and felt no ill effects whatsoever, and the islanders, in the way of people confronted with the inexplicable, immediately reversed their judgment and decided he must be a god. Paul was brought to the estate of the chief man of the island, a Roman official named Publius, whose father was lying sick with fever and dysentery. Paul prayed over the old man and healed him, or so the account tells us, and after this the sick people of the entire island came and were healed. For 3 months, the winter months, during which sailing was impossible, Paul remained on Malta, and whatever he did during those 3 months left a permanent impression. Malta's Catholicism is not merely nominal or formal. It is, in the Maltese understanding of their own history, the oldest Christianity in the world in the sense that it was not converted by missionaries or conquerors coming centuries later. It received the faith directly from the apostle himself in the first generation of the faith's existence. Whether this is historically precise or somewhat embellished in the retelling across 2,000 years is a question for theologians and historians. What is beyond dispute is that Christianity has been the central organising fact of Maltese cultural life for at least 1,600 years, and that the figure of St. Paul, his shipwreck, his snake, his 3 months of healing on their shores, is woven into the fabric of Maltese identity at the deepest possible level. The Jewish community on Malta during the Roman period is documented, if sparsely. There was a significant Jewish diaspora scattered across the Roman Mediterranean by the 1st century CE, and the Acts of the Apostles, in its account of Paul's shipwreck, describes Paul as a Jew of Tarsus without any particular sense that this required explanation or contextualization for its audience, which implies that Jews were a known and accepted presence in the Maltese community. This matters for understanding the reception of Paul and his message. He arrived in a community that already had some frame of reference for Jewish religious concepts, even if the specific claims of early Christianity were entirely new. The Roman period in Malta continued for several centuries after Paul's visit. The island remained part of the Roman imperial system, prosperous and peaceful by the standards of the ancient world, until the larger dissolution of Roman authority in the west during the 5th century CE began to affect even this quiet corner of the Mediterranean. Malta passed under the nominal authority of the Vandals, and then under the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire centred on Constantinople, which reconquered North Africa and the islands of the central Mediterranean in the great campaigns of the 6th century CE under the Emperor Justinian I. The period of Byzantine rule in Malta, from roughly 535 CE to 870 CE, is one of the most obscure phases of the island's history, not because nothing happened during it, but because so little documentary evidence has survived. We know that Malta was part of the Byzantine provincial system, governed from Carthage initially, and later from Syracuse in Sicily. We know that the population remained predominantly Christian, maintaining the faith that had been established in the Roman period. We know that Greek became the administrative language alongside the existing Punic-derived vernacular, and we know, from isolated archaeological finds, that Malta participated in the long-distance trade networks that still knitted the Byzantine world together, even as those networks became increasingly fragile in the face of the empire's contracting power. In the year 870 CE, a fleet from the Jelabid Emirate of Ifriqiya, the Islamic state that controlled what is now Tunisia, sailed north across the Mediterranean and attacked Malta. The island's Byzantine garrison was small, the defences were limited, and after a period of fighting, Malta fell. For the first time in its history, the island came under the rule of an Islamic dynasty. The Arab conquest of Malta is one of the least discussed but most consequential events in the island's history, because the 2 centuries of Arab rule that followed left marks so deep that they are still visible and audible today. The most obvious is the Maltese language itself. Maltese, as mentioned earlier, is a Semitic language, but it is not simply preserved Punic Carthaginian. The language was substantially reshaped during the Arab period, absorbing a great deal of vocabulary, grammar, and phonology from the Siculo-Arabic dialect spoken by the Arab Berber populations who settled on the island. If you compare Maltese to North African Arabic dialects, the relationship is immediately apparent to anyone with training in Semitic linguistics, even though Maltese has since incorporated enormous quantities of Sicilian Italian, Norman French, and English. This linguistic legacy is not trivial. It means that the Maltese people, in the very act of speaking their own language, are carrying forward a biological and cultural inheritance from the Arab populations who settled their islands over 1,000 years ago. Genetic studies conducted in the early 21st century have confirmed this impression. The Maltese gene pool shows significant North African and Middle Eastern ancestry that was most likely introduced or reinforced during the Arab period, layered on top of the older Phoenician Punic heritage that had accumulated over centuries. What was Arab Malta actually like? We know from a small number of Arabic geographical sources and from archaeology that the Arab settlers transformed the island in significant ways. They introduced new agricultural practices, including the cultivation of cotton, citrus trees, and possibly sugarcane, that were improvements on what had come before. They laid out irrigation systems to make better use of the limited rainfall. They built or rebuilt the fortifications of Medina, the walled city in the centre of the island that had been the Roman and Byzantine administrative capital, giving it something of its current form, and they gave names to places that are still in use. Many of Malta's town names and geographical features bear Arabic roots, sometimes clearly, sometimes obscured by centuries of Italianization or Maltese phonetic evolution. The Arab period was also a time of religious complexity. Not all of the pre-Arab Christian population was expelled or converted immediately. The sources suggest that there was a significant Christian community on Malta during at least part of the Arab period, paying tribute and living under Islamic governance, as was typical of the dhimmi system practiced across the Islamic world. Over time, however, the Christian community diminished, either through conversion, emigration, or natural attrition, until by the time the Normans arrived in the late 11th century, the population of Malta appears to have been predominantly Muslim. This would change dramatically and relatively quickly under the next set of rulers. The Normans, those restless descendants of Viking settlers who had made northern France their home, mastered the arts of cavalry warfare and castle building, and conquered England in 1066, were simultaneously conducting a parallel campaign of conquest in the Mediterranean world. Under a remarkable family of warrior administrators called the Hauteville, the Normans had swept through southern Italy and Sicily in the mid-11th century, carving out a kingdom that would eventually become one of the most cosmopolitan and sophisticated states in the medieval world. In 1091, the Norman Count Roger I of Sicily, called Roger the Great Count, distinguishing him from his more famous brother Robert Guiscard, turned his attention to Malta. His campaign was brief and decisive. The Arab garrison offered resistance, but the Normans were militarily superior, and within a short time Malta had passed from Islamic to Christian rule once more. Roger reportedly rebuilt or restored a cathedral in Medina, dedicated to the Virgin Mary as one of his first acts on the island, re-establishing the Christian religious infrastructure that had atrophied during the Arab period. What happened to the Muslim population of Malta under Norman rule is a question that historians have debated. The Normans in Sicily were unusually tolerant by the standards of their era. Their kingdom was a place where Arab Muslims, Greek Orthodox Christians, Latin Catholics and Jews all coexisted under Norman administration, sometimes uneasily but often productively, and this relative tolerance appears to have extended to Malta initially. The Muslim population was not immediately expelled or forcibly converted, but over the following century, through a combination of gradual conversion, emigration, and the slow replacement of the population through immigration from Sicily and southern Italy, the Islamic community on Malta effectively disappeared. By the time the Norman Kingdom of Sicily passed through marriage and inheritance into the control of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the great German imperial family represented most brilliantly by the Emperor Frederick II, himself an extraordinary and controversial figure who spoke 6 languages including Arabic and was on personally cordial terms with the Sultan of Egypt. Malta was a thoroughly Christian island, governed as part of the Kingdom of Sicily and increasingly oriented toward the Italian cultural world rather than the Arab world to which it had belonged for 2 centuries. The medieval centuries that followed were a time of relative stability for Malta, punctuated by occasional turbulence as the Kingdom of Sicily changed hands and allegiances. The Angevin dynasty replaced the Hohenstaufen in the late 13th century, and then in 1282 the famous rebellion known as the Sicilian Vespers drove the French Angevins out of Sicily itself, though they retained southern Italy. Sicily and its dependencies, including Malta, passed to the Crown of Aragon, the expanding Iberian kingdom that was in the process of building a Mediterranean empire of its own. Under Aragonese and then Spanish rule, Malta was a peripheral and not particularly prosperous territory. The island had no significant natural resources other than its harbours and its strategic position, and a Mediterranean that was increasingly dominated by the growing power of the Ottoman Empire in the east did not present comfortable trading conditions for small Christian islands. The population numbered perhaps 12 to 15,000 people, concentrated in and around Mdina in the centre of the island and in a scatter of smaller settlements. The harbour area that would later become the city of Valletta was barely developed, a rocky promontory and a collection of small fishing communities. This was the Malta that the Spanish King Charles I, who was also, as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Christian ruler in Europe, decided to give away in 1530. The Knights of St. John were, by any measure, one of the strangest organisations in the history of Western civilization. They had begun life in the 11th century as a charitable brotherhood, a hospital founded in Jerusalem to care for sick and wounded Christian pilgrims making the journey to the Holy Land. The Hospital of St. John was run by monks who took the traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but who also took on the additional burden of caring for the sick regarding every patient, whatever their social status or national origin, as an image of Christ requiring service. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, the Knights of St. John found themselves in a new and more violent world, and they adapted. They added a 4th commitment to their traditional 3, the obligation to fight as soldiers in defence of the faith and in protection of Christian pilgrims. They became, over the course of the 12th century, one of the most formidable military organisations in the medieval world. A standing professional army of heavily armed cavalry and infantry, organised with the discipline of a religious order, funded by extensive landholdings across Europe, and committed to perpetual war against the Islamic powers that threatened the Christian presence in the Holy Land. The knights fought in the Crusades with extraordinary effectiveness and at extraordinary cost. Their headquarters moved as the Crusader presence in the Holy Land contracted, from Jerusalem to Acre, from Acre to Cyprus, from Cyprus to Rhodes, the great island off the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, which they captured in 1309 and held for more than 2 centuries. From Rhodes, the knights controlled a key node in the eastern Mediterranean trade routes and maintained a constant military pressure on the Ottoman Empire, conducting naval raids, protecting Christian shipping, and occasionally ransom trading captured Ottoman soldiers and officials. In 1522, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman I, who would become known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent, and who was arguably the most capable military commander and administrator in the world at that time, had had enough. He assembled an overwhelming force, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men, and a fleet of several hundred ships, and launched a systematic siege of Rhodes that lasted 6 months. The knights fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered beyond any reasonable hope of relief, and in December of 1522 they surrendered. Suleiman, in a gesture that surprised contemporaries and still impresses historians, permitted the knights to leave Rhodes with full military honours, taking their weapons, their archives, their sacred relics, and whatever they could carry. He even provided them with ships for the journey. When asked why he was being so generous to enemies who had cost him enormous casualties, Suleiman reportedly said that he was sorry to be driving from their home in their old age such brave soldiers. It was a remarkable thing for a conqueror to say, and it speaks to the extent to which even the Ottoman court recognised the knights as a genuinely exceptional military organisation. For 7 years the Knights of St. John were homeless, a military order without a base, wandering between the courts of Catholic Europe, seeking a patron who would give them land to fight from. Charles V of Spain, who was both deeply pious and strategically shrewd, saw an opportunity. He needed someone to defend the central Mediterranean against the Ottoman threat. The knights were the perfect instrument, militarily superb, religiously motivated, financially self-sustaining through their European landholdings, and in desperate need of a home. In 1530, Charles offered the knights the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African port of Tripoli. The annual rent was a single Maltese falcon, to be presented to the Spanish Viceroy of Sicily each year at All Saints' Day, a detail that would become famous through a 20th century detective novel and the film it inspired, lending the phrase, the Maltese falcon, a glamour and cultural resonance that has little to do with the actual history. The knights, after considerable internal debate and negotiation, accepted. And so, in October of 1530, the Knights of St. John arrived in Malta and began the transformation of the island that would define its character for centuries. The Knights' first impressions of Malta were not enthusiastic. Coming from the sophisticated urbanism of Rhodes, a proper medieval city with palaces, markets, and magnificent churches, they found Malta relatively undeveloped, a small, dry, rocky island with a sparse population and a harbour that was excellent in its natural form but had little in the way of proper fortifications or facilities. The Grand Master of the Order at the time, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, who had negotiated the surrender at Rhodes, reportedly described Malta as a bare rock of no value. He was wrong, of course, spectacularly wrong, but it is easy to understand the first impression. The knights began, systematically and with military efficiency, to change what they found. They fortified the headland they called Il Birgu, now the city of Vittoriosa, which protected one side of the Grand Harbour. They built the Fort St. Angelo on its tip, commanding the harbour entrance. They established their hospital, the Sacred Infirmary, which was one of the most advanced medical institutions in the Mediterranean world, and began to project their naval power from the Maltese base, raiding Ottoman shipping, attacking Corsair lairs on the North African coast, and generally maintaining the pressure that was their reason for existence. The Sacred Infirmary of the Knights deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most remarkable institutional achievements of medieval and early modern medicine anywhere in the world. The Order of St. John had, from its founding in Jerusalem in the 11th century, placed the care of the sick at the absolute centre of its identity and mission. The hospital in Valletta, rebuilt and expanded after the Great Siege, was the fullest expression of this medical vocation. At its peak in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Sacred Infirmary was the finest hospital in Europe by most contemporary assessments. The main ward was an extraordinary architectural space, a single vast hall over 150 metres long lined with rows of iron beds. Every patient, regardless of social class, was served on silver plate. The order believed that the dignity of service was part of the healing process, and that the sick deserved the best, not the minimum. The hospital employed multiple physicians and surgeons, maintained a pharmacy stocked with medicines from across the known world, and kept meticulous records of its cases and treatments, records that have survived in part and that have proven invaluable to historians of medicine, tracing the development of clinical practice in the early modern period. The order's approach to medicine was shaped by its unusual position as an institution that bridged the Christian and Islamic worlds. The Knights had spent centuries fighting Muslims, but they had also, in their hospital work, been in continuous contact with the more advanced state of Islamic medical knowledge, the tradition of Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, and the great Arab physicians who had preserved and extended the Greek medical tradition through the centuries when European medicine stagnated. The hospital at Valletta incorporated elements of both traditions. The compassionate care that came from the Christian monastic tradition of hospitality, and the more systematic empirical approach to diagnosis and treatment that characterized the better Islamic medical institutions of the medieval period. The Knights also maintained what was, by the standards of the time, an enlightened approach to mental illness. At a period when madness was widely regarded as spiritual affliction to be treated by exorcism or confinement, the Sacred Infirmary had a specific ward for mental patients where care, rather than punishment, was the guiding principle. This was not common in the 17th century. It would take another 100 years before the reformers of the Enlightenment began systematically arguing for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, and the Order's approach speaks to an institutional compassion that is easy to overlook in an organisation most famous for military exploits and religious warfare. The cultural life of the Knights Malta was surprisingly rich and varied. The Order attracted talented individuals from across the Catholic world, not only soldiers but scholars, artists, musicians and architects, and Valletta became a genuinely cosmopolitan city of culture. The Opera House hosted performances that drew on the best musical traditions of Italy. The printing press, introduced to Malta under the Order, produced theological and legal texts, but also humanistic scholarship, poetry and history. The Order's collection of books and manuscripts, carefully assembled over centuries and now held in the National Library of Malta, is one of the most significant archives of early modern Mediterranean history in existence. The Knights also established a university, the Collegium Melitense, which was the predecessor of the modern University of Malta, providing education in theology, law, medicine, and the humanities to a population that had previously been largely dependent on the Church for formal instruction. This educational institution would prove durable far beyond the Order's own tenure on the island. The University of Malta is still in operation today, one of the oldest universities in the world with a continuous institutional history, having survived the Order's departure, the French occupation, 2 centuries of British rule, and the transformation to independence. The relationship between the Knights and the Maltese people over the nearly 3 centuries of the Order's rule evolved in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. There was always a fundamental inequality at the heart of the arrangement. The Knights were a self-selected military aristocracy of foreign birth, governing a native population that had no real voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. The Grand Masters issued legislation that was not subject to Maltese approval. The Order taxed the Maltese people and occasionally commandeered their labour for fortification work. The social hierarchy of the Order, its internal divisions between different national langues, its aristocratic entry requirements, its celibate male exclusivity, had no meaningful connection to the structure of Maltese society. And yet the Maltese people were not simply passive subjects of foreign domination. They had their own nobility and their own church hierarchy, led by the Bishop of Malta, who was independent of the Order, and who sometimes served as a champion of Maltese interests against the Grand Masters. There were periodic conflicts between the Order and the Bishop, between the Order and the Maltese nobility, and between the Order and the common people over specific grievances. Tax disputes, conscription for galley service, commercial regulations that disadvantaged Maltese merchants. These conflicts could be bitter and prolonged, and they remind us that the Malta of the Knights was not a unified or harmonious society, but a layered and sometimes tense one. What held it together ultimately was the shared reality of the island situation, a small Catholic community in the middle of a sea in which the Ottoman threat was real and proximate, in which piracy and raiding from the North African coast were constant dangers, and in which the Order's military presence provided a degree of security that no other available arrangement could have matched. The Maltese might resent the Knights' arrogance and their foreign ways, but they also knew, and 1565 would demonstrate this conclusively, that the island's safety depended on the Order's military power. By 1565, the strategic stakes in the central Mediterranean had reached an almost unbearable pitch of tension. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent had become the largest and most powerful state in the known world, stretching from the gates of Vienna in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia to the depths of the Sudan. Ottoman armies had annihilated the Hungarian kingdom at the Battle of Mohács in 1526 and besieged Vienna in 1529. Ottoman fleets, often commanded by the terrifying Corsair Admiral Khaireddin Barbarossa, had swept across the Mediterranean with near impunity, raiding Genoa, attacking the Spanish coast, and effectively denying the Western Mediterranean to Christian commerce for extended periods. Against this titan, the Knights of St. John on their rocky island were a persistent and infuriating thorn. They raided Ottoman shipping with great effectiveness, disrupting the commerce that fed the empire. They sheltered and cooperated with Spanish and Genoese naval forces that attempted to challenge Ottoman dominance. They stood, in the symbolic geography of the Mediterranean conflict, as the most visible Christian outpost in the Central Sea, the one place that had not surrendered to Ottoman power. Suleiman had already expelled the knights from Rhodes. He fully intended to expel them from Malta as well. The planning for the assault on Malta was meticulous. Suleiman assembled a force that contemporaries estimated at between 30 and 50,000 soldiers. Modern historians suggest the figure was probably closer to 20 to 25,000 effectives, still an overwhelming force, carried by a fleet of approximately 200 ships. He appointed as his overall commander a capable and experienced Ottoman admiral named Piyale Pasha, with the legendary corsair captain Turgut Reis, known in the West as Dragut, serving as a senior advisor. On land, the Janissary and Sipahi forces were commanded by Mustafa Pasha, one of the empire's most experienced and capable soldiers. Opposing this force, the knights had approximately 500 to 600 knights of the order, supported by roughly 6,000 soldiers, a combination of Spanish infantry, Italian and Maltese troops, and various other professionals and volunteers. In terms of raw numbers, the Ottomans outnumbered the defenders by at least 4 to 1. In terms of artillery, the Ottoman advantage was even more pronounced. They had brought a massive siege train of heavy guns that could reduce stone fortifications to rubble, given enough time and ammunition. The Grand Master of the Order in 1565 was Jean Parisot de Valletta, a man of 70 years, a knight since childhood, who had fought at Rhodes, had survived a year as a galley slave on an Ottoman warship after being captured in a naval battle, and who combined personal physical courage with a strategic and psychological intelligence that would prove decisive in the weeks ahead. De Valletta was not a complicated man. He was a warrior monk shaped by a lifetime of absolute commitment to his order and his faith. But he possessed a quality that is rarer than intelligence or courage, the ability to remain calm and clear-headed under the most extreme imaginable pressure, and to communicate that calmness to others. The Ottoman fleet appeared off Malta on the 18th of May, 1565. What followed was among the most extraordinary episodes in the military history of the Renaissance world. A siege that would last almost 4 months, would claim thousands of lives on both sides, and would be followed across Europe with the same breathless intensity that today's world reserves for major international crises. The Ottomans' first objective was Fort St. Elmo, a small but strategically critical fortification built on the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula, the long tongue of land that separated the Grand Harbour from the northern harbour, called Marsamxet. Fort St. Elmo was not a large fort. It was designed to hold a garrison of perhaps a few hundred men, and it was clearly not the equal of the main defensive works at Fort St. Angelo and the fortified town of Birgu. But it commanded the approach to both harbours, and the Ottomans could not safely use their fleet in either harbour while it held. The Ottoman bombardment of Fort St. Elmo began in late May. It was of an intensity that observers, including professional soldiers who had seen many sieges, described as something beyond their previous experience. The heavy Ottoman guns poured shot into the small fort around the clock, reducing sections of wall to rubble, killing the defenders in the open, creating a landscape of smashed stone and smoke and fire. The knights and soldiers inside were reinforced repeatedly by night, when small boats could slip across the harbour from Birgu under the noses of the Ottoman fleet, and they repaired their defences by night almost, as quickly as the guns knocked them down by day. The defence of Fort St. Elmo became one of the defining episodes of the siege. The men inside, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted, all of them aware that their position was ultimately untenable, continued to fight with a ferocity that astonished their besiegers. There are accounts of the old and badly wounded being carried to the walls in chairs so that they could continue to fight when they could no longer stand. There are accounts of de Valletta refusing to order an evacuation, even when it became clear that the fort could not be held indefinitely, because every day that Fort St. Elmo held was a day the main defences could be strengthened and the possibility of relief from Sicily kept alive. The legendary Turgut Reis himself was mortally wounded at Fort St. Elmo on the 17th of June, struck by a splinter of stone or metal while directing the bombardment from the trenches. He died the following day without regaining full consciousness, and his loss was a severe blow to Ottoman morale and strategic coherence. He was the most experienced and capable Ottoman commander in the Western Mediterranean, a man who had spent his entire career fighting these waters and these enemies, and his absence would be felt in the weeks that followed. To understand why his death mattered so profoundly, you have to understand who Turgut Reis actually was, not simply a name attached to an event, but a figure of extraordinary biography, one of those rare lives so improbable that they would feel invented if the historical record did not confirm them at every turn. He was, by the time of his death at Malta, roughly 80 years old, ancient by the standards of the era, and particularly ancient for a man who had spent his entire working life in the extremely hazardous profession of Mediterranean corsair and Ottoman naval commander. He had been born in a small Aegean village, gone to sea as a young man, mastered the art of naval warfare in the service of the great Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha, and risen through the Ottoman system entirely on the basis of his abilities at a time when such a thing was genuinely possible within the meritocratic structures of Ottoman military command. He had been captured by Genoese forces during a corsair raid early in his career and sentenced to labour at the oar of a Genoese galley, among the worst fates available in the 16th century Mediterranean, and had endured years of galley slavery before being ransomed by Barbarossa himself. He had survived capture, imprisonment, the brutal physics of naval combat, decades of storms and campaign winters, and an astonishing catalogue of enemies who had wanted him dead. By 1565 he was the living memory of 2 generations of Ottoman naval power in the Western Mediterranean, the man who knew its harbours, its tides, its landing points, and its people better than any other commander alive. He knew Malta. He had raided it before. He understood its geography in a way that the land commanders could not, and his strategic intelligence was recognised even by his enemies. The Knights of St. John feared him more than any other Ottoman commander, because they understood, correctly, that he was the most likely person to find the way through a defence that had been designed specifically to keep the Ottoman Empire out. When a stone fragment from an exploding fortification wall ended his consciousness on that June afternoon, the Ottoman High Command lost its most irreplaceable asset, not just a general, but a repository of understanding about this particular theatre of war that could not be improvised or replaced from the ranks of commanders still available. Fort St. Elmo fell on the 23rd of June, 1565, the feast day of St. John the Baptist, the patron of the Order of St. John. The timing was almost too perfect, too drenched in religious symbolism for contemporaries not to note it. Nearly every defender was dead. The Ottomans had paid for the fort at a price of roughly 4,000 men, an almost inconceivable cost for a position that should, by any normal calculus, have fallen in days rather than weeks. An Ottoman commander surveying the ruins and the bodies of his men is reported to have turned to Mustafa Pasha and said something that has been paraphrased many ways in the centuries since, but whose essence was, "If this is what the son cost us, what will the father cost us?" The father was Fort St. Angelo, bigger, stronger, and defended by the full force of the garrison. Mustafa Pasha, furious at the losses his force had taken, ordered a savage act of psychological warfare. The bodies of the dead knights were beheaded, the heads removed, and the headless torsos were bound to wooden crosses and floated across the Grand Harbour toward Birgu in the light of early morning. De Valette's response was equally grim. He had the Ottoman prisoners in his possession, executed and their heads loaded into the order's cannon, which then fired the heads back across the water toward the Ottoman lines. The war of nerves was underway, and the real siege was just beginning. Through July and into August, the Ottomans turned their full force on Birgu and the connected fortification of Senglia. The bombardment was even heavier than what had destroyed Fort St. Elmo. Sections of wall were battered down, and the Ottoman assault troops poured through, again and again, only to be thrown back by the defenders in brutal close quarters fighting. De Valette led the defence from the front, personally entering the breach on at least one occasion, when a wall section collapsed and the Ottomans were streaming through, rallying his men by his physical presence alone. He was wounded in the leg by a grenade fragment during one of these moments, but refused to leave the fighting. The Ottoman forces attempted a naval assault on Senglia across the harbour, sending a flotilla of small boats loaded with soldiers to attack the town's waterfront defences. The knights had anticipated this and had stretched a chain and timber boom beneath the water's surface across the harbour approach. The Ottoman boats hit the boom, fouled their oars, and were caught in the open water by a battery of guns concealed behind the town walls. The gun crews destroyed much of the assault force before it could reach the shore. It was a decisive repulse, and it demonstrated that the Ottoman numerical advantage counted for less in the confined, complex geography of the Grand Harbour than it might have on an open battlefield. The reverberations of the Great Siege spread far beyond the shores of Malta and far beyond the immediate political and military consequences of the Ottoman withdrawal. The siege entered the cultural consciousness of Catholic Europe as one of those rare events that simultaneously confirmed existing beliefs and created new ones, a moment of historical drama so intense that it demanded to be made into story, image, poem, and eventually theatre. Within years of the siege, accounts of it were being published in multiple languages across Europe. Francesco Balbi di Correggio, a Spanish infantry soldier who had served in the garrison, published his eyewitness account in 1567, a narrative of extraordinary vividness that has served as a primary source for historians of the siege ever since. Balbi had a soldier's eye for detail and a soldier's directness of language, and his account of specific moments, the death of colleagues, the state of the fortifications under bombardment, the texture of daily life inside a besieged position, gives the siege a human immediacy that no amount of strategic analysis can fully replace. Artists across Europe attempted to capture the siege in visual form. Matteo Perez d'Aleccio painted a famous series of large-scale frescoes depicting the major episodes of the siege, which were hung in the Hall of the Grand, Master's Palace in Valletta, and which still hang there today. Massive, turbulent compositions full of smoke and fire and struggling figures, painted with the dramatic energy that the Baroque style was beginning to discover. The paintings are not entirely accurate historically, but they are extraordinarily effective as propaganda and as art. They communicate the scale, the violence, and the ultimate triumph of the siege in terms that any viewer could immediately grasp. The siege also had profound effects on the military architecture of the following century. The failure of Fort St. Elmo, or rather, its heroic but inevitable fall, was studied carefully by military engineers across Europe, and the lessons they drew from it accelerated the development of the angle-bastioned fortification system that would become the standard defensive architecture of the 17th and 18th centuries. The new city of Valletta itself, designed immediately after the siege, embodied the most advanced thinking in Renaissance military architecture. Its bastions were angled to eliminate blind spots. Its defensive walls were of sufficient depth and mass to absorb cannon fire without collapsing, and its approach was designed to funnel any attacker into zones of concentrated defensive fire. The Ottoman side of the siege also repays attention, because the story has too often been told exclusively from the Christian perspective. The Ottoman army that besieged Malta in 1565 was composed of some of the most professional and experienced soldiers in the world, janissaries who had fought in Hungary, Persia, and Egypt, sailors who had navigated the Mediterranean from one end to the other, engineers who had successfully besieged fortifications across 3 continents. They fought with skill and courage, and they died in enormous numbers. Mustafa Pasha has been treated harshly by most Western historians, who have emphasised his tactical errors and his ultimately unsuccessful outcome. But a more nuanced reading of the campaign suggests a commander faced with genuinely difficult decisions, operating under time pressure, with a mixed force facing a defensive position of greater strength and more determined resistance than his intelligence had suggested. As August progressed, both sides were exhausted and depleted. The Ottomans had lost enormous numbers of men. Estimates vary widely, but several thousand dead from assault, bombardment, and disease seems probable. The defenders had lost a significant fraction of their original force as well, and were running short of ammunition, food, and the simple human capacity to continue fighting without rest. The question was which side's will would break first. It was the Ottomans' will that broke in the end, though not from any single dramatic moment, but from the accumulation of failure and loss over 3.5 months of siege. On the 7th of September 1565, a Spanish relief force of approximately 8,000 soldiers landed on the northwestern coast of Malta, having finally been assembled and dispatched by the Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo. The news of the relief force's arrival spread through the Ottoman camp, and Mustafa Pasha, assessing the military situation, his depleted force, his exhausted ships, the approaching autumn storms, made the decision to withdraw. The Ottoman fleet sailed away from Malta in the second week of September, 1565, and the Great Siege was over. The news spread across Europe with astonishing speed. In Rome, the Pope ordered bonfires lit in celebration. In Spain, services of thanksgiving were held. In Venice, which had watched the siege with intense anxiety, knowing that a fall of Malta would have opened the western Mediterranean to unchallenged Ottoman naval power, the relief was described as a deliverance of Christendom itself. Philip II of Spain reportedly said that he did not know who this Jean de Valletta was, but that the world owed him a great deal. De Valletta himself, surveying the ruins of his fortifications and the graves of his fallen knights, is reported to have said nothing at all for a long time. The first act of de Valletta and the surviving knights after the Ottomans departed was to begin planning a new, properly fortified city. Not merely repaired and reinforced versions of the existing settlements, but an entirely new urban creation, designed from the ground up, according to the most advanced principles of Renaissance military architecture. The site chosen was the Sybaris Peninsula, the very ground where Fort St. Elmo stood, where so many had died, the high tongue of rock that commanded both the Grand Harbour and Marsamxett. De Valletta laid the first stone on the 28th of March, 1566. Pope Pius V sent his personal architect, Francesco Laparelli, to design the city, and Laparelli, who had previously worked on the design of the Vatican's defences, brought with him the full sophistication of Italian Renaissance urban planning. The city was named Valletta, Valletta in the Italian and English versions, Il Belt, simply the city in Maltese, which tells you something about how completely it dominated the island's urban landscape from the moment of its construction. It was planned as a proper city, not just a military installation, with a regular grid of streets, with auberges for each of the order's longs, with a co-cathedral dedicated to St. John the Baptist, with a palace for the Grand Master, with hospitals, markets, fountains and gardens. The streets were laid out on a grid that ran north-south and east-west, with the main avenue, what is now Republic Street, running the full length of the peninsula from the city gate to Fort St. Elmo. The construction of Valletta was one of the great urban projects of the 16th century. Thousands of Maltese workers were employed. The order's finances, drawn from its extensive European landholdings, were committed on a massive scale. Skilled architects, engineers and craftsmen were imported from Italy and Spain. The city rose, stone course by stone course, from the rubble of the siege, and within decades it was recognisable as one of the finest cities in the Mediterranean world. Elegant, ordered, and almost impregnable. The co-cathedral of St. John, completed in the 1570s, became over the following century one of the most spectacularly decorated Baroque interiors anywhere in the world. Its floor was paved over the course of 2 centuries, with nearly 400 elaborate marble tombstones, each marking the grave of a knight of the order, each carved with the knight's heraldic arms and an allegorical scene of death and resurrection. The walls and ceiling were painted by Mattia Preti, a Calabrian artist who came to Malta in 1661 and spent the rest of his life there, covering the ceiling of the nave with a continuous cycle of paintings depicting the life of John the Baptist that is among the great masterpieces of Baroque painting in the world. And in the chapel of the Long of Castile there hung, and still hangs, a painting that is widely regarded as one of the 2 or 3 greatest paintings ever made in the Western tradition. The beheading of St. John the Baptist was painted by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio in 1608, during the artist's brief and turbulent stay in Malta. It is the only painting Caravaggio ever signed. He wrote his name in the blood flowing from the severed neck of St. John, a gesture of such audacity and psychological complexity that it still disturbs viewers today. Caravaggio arrived in Malta as a refugee. He was fleeing Rome, where he had killed a man in a brawl, and he hoped that service to the knights might earn him a papal pardon. He was made a knight himself, one of the very few people in the order's history to achieve that status without noble birth, purely on the basis of his extraordinary talent, and he painted several works for the order during his time on the island. His fall from grace was as dramatic as his arrival. He quarrelled violently with another knight, was imprisoned in Fort St. Angelo, managed somehow to escape, and fled Malta never to return. The painting he left behind remained, an almost supernatural object of beauty and darkness hanging in the most opulent church on an island that had been built from violence and faith. The century between the Great Siege and the arrival of Napoleon represents, in some respects, the fullest flowering of what the Knights Malta could be. The immediate decades after the siege were consumed with the enormous project of building Valletta and extending and strengthening the island's fortifications. But as the 17th century unfolded, and as the acute existential threat of the Ottoman Empire gradually receded, Malta became something more than a military installation. It became a centre of Baroque culture in the Mediterranean world, a place where the extraordinary artistic and architectural energies of the 17th century found expression in some of their most dramatic and concentrated forms. The churches that the Knights built and decorated across Malta and Gozo are, collectively, one of the great Baroque ensembles in the world, not individually as famous as the masterpieces of Rome or Venice, but remarkable in their number, their quality, and the consistency of their ambition. In a small island of modest population and limited agricultural resources, the investment in religious architecture that the Knights facilitated produced a built environment of startling richness. The Baroque style, which emerged in Rome in the early 17th century as the artistic expression of the Counter-Reformation, was perfectly suited to the Knights' purposes and self-image. Here was an organisation that understood itself as the military and spiritual vanguard of Catholic Christianity, fighting a centuries-long war against the Ottoman Empire in defence of the faith. The Baroque's emphasis on drama, emotion, physical sensation, and the direct impact of art on the beholder resonated deeply with an organisation for whom faith was not primarily a matter of quiet personal devotion, but of public, communal, and sometimes violent affirmation. By the mid-18th century, however, the cultural and institutional confidence that the order projected externally was masking a deeper malaise. The Knights were, in essence, an institution designed for a specific historical moment, the Crusading Age, the period of acute confrontation between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire, and that moment was passing. The Ottoman Empire was in decline, its military capacity visibly reduced from the terrifying peak of Suleiman's era. The great naval battles of the central Mediterranean were becoming rarer, the existential threat that had given the order its raison d'etre less immediate. The order's internal life, meanwhile, was being corroded by the same Enlightenment currents that were undermining traditional institutions across Europe. The younger generations of knights, many of them from aristocratic families that were being reshaped by Enlightenment ideas about reason, individual rights, and the critique of traditional authority, were less committed to the order's medieval values of total obedience, celibacy, and perpetual warfare than their predecessors had been. Discipline declined. The elaborate hierarchy of the order began to feel less like a source of strength and more like an empty form. The French Revolution, when it broke out in 1789, was therefore not merely a political event for the Knights of Malta. It was an existential crisis. The revolution confiscated the order's extensive French landholdings. The Langue of France, which had always been the order's wealthiest and most prestigious division, was financially devastated overnight. The order's financial base contracted. Sharply, its recruitment dried up, and its institutional coherence began to unravel in ways that the siege of 1565 had never threatened. It was this already weakened institution that Napoleon encountered in June 1798. In June of 1798, the most dynamic military commander in the world was sailing past Malta with an army of 32,000 men in his ships. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was 38 years old, a general of the French Republic leading the Egyptian expedition, an extraordinarily ambitious plan to strike at British power in the east by seizing Egypt and potentially threatening British India. The route to Egypt led through the central Mediterranean, and the central Mediterranean meant Malta. Napoleon had been aware of Malta's strategic importance since at least 1796, when he first began to think seriously about the Egyptian campaign. His correspondence from this period shows a clear understanding of what the island represented. "Malta is of more value to us than all of Italy together," he reportedly wrote. He was exaggerating, but not absurdly so. A French-controlled Malta would give France a naval base at the centre of the Mediterranean, threatening British communications with India via the Levant and dominating the central sea routes in a way that no other position could. When the French fleet arrived off Malta on the 9th of June, 1798, Napoleon sent a message to the Grand Master of the Knights, Ferdinand von Hompesch, a Bavarian nobleman who had been Grand Master for less than a year, and who was, by general contemporary assessment, a thoroughly inadequate man for the moment, requesting permission to water his ships and reprovision his fleet. Von Hompesch, citing the order's neutrality and the rules of the port, refused to allow more than 4 ships at a time into the harbour. Napoleon, who was not a man who tolerated obstacles to his plans with any patience, immediately ordered an assault. The French landed on multiple points of the island simultaneously on the 10th of June, and von Hompesch's garrison, a mix of aging knights, underpaid Maltese troops, and a handful of regular soldiers, collapsed almost immediately. The Maltese infantry were not cowards. Many of them fought with real courage at various points during the brief campaign, but they were outnumbered, outgeneraled, and faced an army that had been defeating the best military forces in Europe for years. On the 11th of June, 1798, less than 48 hours after the French had begun their assault, von Hompesch surrendered Malta to Napoleon. It was, by any measure, one of the most ignominious capitulations in military history, particularly given the story of 1565. A garrison of thousands, behind fortifications that had famously defied the full power of Suleiman's Ottoman army, had held out for less than 2 days against a force that was, if anything, less well equipped for siege warfare than the Ottomans had been. The contrast with de Vallette's achievement 233 years earlier was painful enough to require no comment at the time. Contemporaries commented on it anyway, with considerable bitterness. Napoleon spent 6 days on Malta, enough time to loot the order's treasury, reorganise the island's administration on French Republican principles, abolish feudal privileges, free Muslim slaves, close religious houses, and generally apply the revolutionary template that the French were imposing on every territory they occupied. He then sailed on to Egypt, leaving a garrison of around 3,000 French soldiers under General Claude-Henri Vaubois to hold the island. The French occupation of Malta lasted not quite 2 years, and it was not a happy time. Napoleon's administration had abolished many of the traditional privileges and institutions that organised Maltese society, had stripped the churches of their valuables, and had failed to deliver the material improvements that the revolutionary rhetoric had promised. The Maltese, who were among the most devoutly Catholic populations in Europe, were particularly offended by the anti-clerical measures, the suppression of monasteries, the treatment of church property, the general contempt for religious institutions that characterised French revolutionary governance across Europe. In September 1798, barely 3 months after the French had taken the island, the Maltese rose in rebellion. It began in the town of Mdina, the ancient walled city in the centre of the island, when French soldiers attempted to auction off the contents of a Carmelite church. The crowd turned on the soldiers opened fire, and the spark ignited a general uprising across the island. The French garrison retreated to Valletta and the harbour fortifications, which they could hold against the Maltese rebels, but from which they could not easily operate across the rest of the island. The Maltese rebels, needing outside help, to dislodge the French from Valletta's formidable defences, turned to the nearest available power, Britain. The Royal Navy, which had been hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean since Nelson's pursuit of Napoleon to Egypt, culminating in the Great Battle of the Nile in August 1798, which had destroyed the French fleet and cut off Napoleon's army in Egypt, was happy to assist. British ships began blockading Malta's harbours, preventing supplies from reaching the French garrison, while the Maltese rebels contained the French on land. The siege of Valletta lasted nearly 2 years. The French garrison, under Vaubois, held out with considerable tenacity. There is a grim irony in the fact that the fortifications built by the knights to withstand an Ottoman siege were now being used by French Republicans to hold out against British and Maltese forces, but starvation eventually did what military assault could not. In September 1800, Vaubois surrendered Valletta to the British commander Rear Admiral Sir Alexander Ball, who accepted on behalf of the Maltese people as much as on behalf of the British Crown. Malta was British. The British acquisition of Malta was formalised, after some international negotiation, by the Treaty of Paris in 1814. Malta was constituted as a British Crown colony, which it would remain for the next 150 years. The strategic logic that had driven every previous claimant to the island had not changed. If anything, it had intensified in the age of steam power and the expanding British Empire. For Britain, Malta's position in the central Mediterranean was not merely useful, but structurally essential to maintaining the empire. The key was the route to India. Britain's most important and most profitable imperial possession was the Indian subcontinent, and the most practical sea route from Britain to India ran through the Mediterranean, across Egypt or down the Red Sea, and east across the Indian Ocean. Malta sat squarely on this route. A British naval base at Malta meant that Britain could maintain naval superiority in the Mediterranean, protect the route to India, project military power toward the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant and Egypt, and threaten any European power that attempted to challenge British commercial or military dominance in the region. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 made this route even more important, and made Malta even more central to British strategic thinking. The canal cut the distance from Britain to India dramatically, and the Mediterranean became the most heavily trafficked sea lane in the world. The Grand Harbour at Valletta was developed into one of the most impressive naval facilities in existence, a full-scale dockyard capable of building, repairing, and supplying major warships, surrounded by the most modern fortifications that Victorian military engineering could provide. The British period in Malta was, like all colonial relationships, complex and not without its contradictions and tensions. The British brought investment, legal institutions, modern administration, and the English language, which sits alongside Maltese and Italian as one of the island's official languages to this day. They built schools, hospitals, roads, and communication infrastructure. They developed the harbour dockyard into one of the island's major employers, providing work for thousands of Maltese craftsmen, labourers, and engineers. They introduced a degree of political representation, cautiously and gradually, as British colonial administrations generally did, and they treated Malta as something more than merely an occupied territory, recognising the Maltese people's own distinct identity and history. Language was a particular source of conflict. The British attempted, at various points in the 19th century, to impose English as the primary language of administration and education, against the preference of much of the Maltese establishment for Italian, which had been the language of culture and administration under the Knights, and which carried enormous social prestige on the island. The language question in Malta was not simply a matter of linguistic preference. It was bound up with questions of cultural identity, political allegiance, and the tension between British colonial authority and Maltese self-determination. These tensions simmered through the later 19th and early 20th centuries. Mussolini's Italy, aggressively promoting itself as the heir to Rome and the natural leader of the Mediterranean world, was not above encouraging pro-Italian sentiment in Malta as part of its broader Mediterranean ambitions, a fact that would become deeply consequential when the Second World War began in June 1940 and Italy declared itself on the side of Nazi Germany. The siege of Malta in the Second World War was not a siege in the classical sense. There was no army surrounding the island, no trenches dug, no assault troops storming the walls. It was conducted from the air by the Regia Aeronautica of Italy and the Luftwaffe of Germany, and its instruments were bombs rather than cannonballs, and its targets were not only military installations but the harbours, the docks, the houses, the streets, and the people of the island themselves. Italy declared war on Britain and France on the 10th of June 1940, and the very next day, actually the 11th, one day after the formal declaration, Italian bombers attacked Malta. This attack set the tone for what was to come, a campaign of strategic bombing that aimed to destroy Malta's military usefulness and ultimately to break the will of its population. The island's air defences at the outbreak of the war were, by any measure, grotesquely inadequate. The RAF had provided Malta with exactly 3 Gloucester Gladiator biplane fighters, obsolete aircraft from the mid-1930s, which were hastily assembled from crates in the dockyard and put into the air to meet the Italian raids. These 3 aircraft, named Faith, Hope, and Charity by the Maltese population, with a combination of gallows, humour and genuine religious feeling, became symbols of the island's defiance during the early months of the campaign. Of the 3 original Gladiators, only Faith survived the war, and she can be seen today in the Malta War Museum in Valletta, restored and displayed as a national relic. Additional aircraft were dispatched to Malta as the war progressed. Hurricanes initially, later Spitfires, but the island was always undersupplied and always operating at the edge of what was sustainable. The combination of distance from Britain, the danger of Mediterranean supply routes, and the relentless pressure of the Axis bombing made Malta's situation desperate in a way that is almost impossible to convey in ordinary language. The bombing intensified dramatically in early 1942, when the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps transferred from the Russian front to Sicily and began applying the same systematic professional destructiveness to Malta that it had applied to Coventry, Belgrade, and Leningrad. In the months of March and April 1942, Malta was subjected to a bombardment that, by some calculations, dropped more tonnage of bombs per square kilometre than any comparable period of the London Blitz. On some days, the raids came in waves, 6, 7, 8 separate attacks between dawn and dusk, each one sending the population underground, into the ancient limestone shelters and tunnels that honeycombed the islands. The people of Malta lived for extended periods underground. The limestone geology of the island, which had made its harbours so perfect and its fortifications so durable, also provided an unexpected gift in the form of rock that could be quarried relatively easily into tunnels and shelters. Hundreds of tunnels had been dug before and during the war, and into these the Maltese population retreated when the air raid siren sounded, which was many times per day. Children were born in the tunnels, old people died in them. The ordinary rhythms of life, eating, sleeping, working, going to school, going to church, were distorted beyond recognition by the necessity of survival. The food situation became critical. Malta grew some of its own food but was not remotely self-sufficient. It depended on imported grain, fuel, medicine, and ammunition to survive. With the Mediterranean effectively dominated by Axis air power, and with Italy's Regia Marina making convoy operations extremely dangerous, the convoys that attempted to reach Malta suffered terrible losses. The Santa Maria convoy of August 1942, named for the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which falls on the 15th of August, is the most famous of these convoy operations, and its story encapsulates the entire drama of Malta's war. The convoy, known formally as Operation Pedestal, consisted of 14 merchant ships and a massive naval escort, 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers and 32 destroyers, the largest and most powerful convoy escort ever assembled. It was necessary because Malta was close to starvation. The island's supply situation had deteriorated to the point where the British government had privately calculated that if a major resupply did not arrive by September 1942, Malta would have no choice but to surrender. The convoy entered the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar on the 10th of August and immediately began to take losses. Axis submarines, aircraft and torpedo boats attacked in waves. An aircraft carrier, HMS Eagle, was sunk by a U-boat within hours of passing Gibraltar. Further ships were lost or damaged as the convoy fought its way east through attacks that lasted day and night. By the time the convoy approached Malta, 9 of the 14 merchant ships had been sunk, and of the surviving 5, several were damaged. One of them, the American tanker Ohio, had been hit so severely that she was kept afloat only by being lashed between 2 destroyers that literally carried her into the Grand Harbour. Ohio's arrival in the Grand Harbour on the 15th of August 1942, the feast of Santa Maria, the Assumption, is one of the most celebrated moments in Maltese history. The ship was nearly at the bottom of the sea. She could barely float. She was lashed between destroyers like a wounded animal being carried by 2 strong friends, and when she came through the harbour entrance, the people who had lined the Valletta waterfront to watch, the people who had lived underground for months, who had been bombed every day, who were hungry and frightened and exhausted, those people erupted. They cheered and wept and sang. The tanker that was barely surviving was carrying the fuel that would keep Malta's aircraft flying, and Malta's generators running for the weeks ahead, and those weeks would be the decisive weeks in the North African campaign. Within 2 months of Operation Pedestal, Montgomery's 8th Army defeated Rommel at El Alamein, and the Afrika Korps began its long retreat westward. The connection between Malta's survival and the North African victory is not speculative. It is structural. Malta-based aircraft and submarines had been attacking the Axis supply lines to North Africa throughout the war, sinking ships and aircraft carrying fuel, ammunition, tanks, and reinforcements that Rommel desperately needed. Without Malta's interdiction capacity, Rommel would have been better supplied, better fueled, and better able to absorb the losses of the November 1942 battles. Without Malta, El Alamein might have gone differently, and El Alamein was the turning point of the war in the Mediterranean theatre. King George VI recognised this relationship, and in April 1942, at the height of the bombing, when Malta's survival was genuinely uncertain, he awarded the George Cross to Malta, not to a particular person or unit, but to the island as a whole, to its entire civilian population. The citation read, "To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." It was the first, and to this day, only time the George Cross has been awarded collectively to a community rather than an individual, and the Maltese still carry that distinction with justifiable pride. The George Cross is incorporated into the Maltese national flag, where it appears alongside the traditional red and white colours of the island. The bombing gradually subsided through the latter half of 1942, as Axis attention and resources shifted to the deteriorating situation in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. By 1943, Malta was not only surviving but thriving as a military base. It served as the primary staging point for Operation Husky in July 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily that began the liberation of Italy. Eisenhower commanded the invasion from Malta, and the island's harbours, airfields, and administrative facilities managed the enormous logistical complexity of landing more than 150,000 troops on the beaches of Sicily. The pivot point of the Mediterranean war effort was exactly where it had always been, where geography had always dictated it must be. The end of the Second World War did not immediately resolve the question of Malta's political status. The island was physically devastated. The bombing had destroyed tens of thousands of buildings, damaged almost every structure in the harbour area, and left psychological wounds in the population that would take a generation to heal. But the Maltese were not passive recipients of whatever the post-war order might deliver. They had a political voice, a tradition of representation within the colonial framework, and a very clear sense of what they had contributed to the Allied victory. In the immediate post-war years, there was serious discussion of Malta's future status, including, remarkably, proposal for full integration of Malta into the United Kingdom as a constituency of the British Parliament. This proposal was put to a referendum in 1956 and received majority support, but it foundered on the practical and political difficulties of genuine integration, and the Conservative government in Britain was never fully committed to making it work. The proposal collapsed, leaving Malta in an intermediate position, too important to be ignored, too proud to accept indefinite colonial status. Full independence came on the 21st of September 1964. Malta became a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations and the British Commonwealth, with a constitution and a parliament and all the formal apparatus of nationhood. The first Prime Minister of independent Malta was George Borg-Olivier, who had led the Nationalist Party through the independence negotiations, and the transition was accomplished with the peaceful, orderly efficiency that the British were at their best, capable of managing. But independence did not immediately clarify Malta's strategic position. The island was still heavily dependent on British military spending. The Royal Navy's dockyard and the British military installations employed a significant fraction of Malta's working population. When the Labour government of Dom Mintoff, one of the most colourful and controversial political figures in Maltese history, a socialist and nationalist of considerable rhetorical force and strategic cunning, came to power in 1971, it renegotiated the terms of British military presence on the island aggressively, eventually expelling the British forces entirely in March 1979. The image of the last British troops leaving Malta in March 1979 brought to an end a military relationship that had lasted, in various forms, for almost 180 years. For many Maltese, it was a moment of genuine satisfaction, the completion of a process of self-determination that had been generations in the making. For others, particularly those whose livelihoods had depended on the British military presence, it was a moment of anxiety about what would come next. There is something deeply symbolic in that departure, something worth sitting with for a moment, because in all of Malta's long and layered history, the moment when the last foreign military force left the island is itself unprecedented. For 7,000 years, Malta had been, in some meaningful sense, controlled by a power based elsewhere. Phoenicians and Carthaginians, Romans and Arabs, Normans and the various medieval dynasties, the Knights, Napoleon, the British. Even during the periods of relative autonomy and benign rule, The ultimate decision-making power had rested outside the island, in Carthage, or Rome, or Palermo, or Toledo, or Paris, or London. The flag that flew over the Grand Harbour was always, in some sense, someone else's flag. For the Maltese people, who had survived all of those masters, who had absorbed and resisted and adapted to all of those cultures while somehow remaining irreducibly themselves, March 1979 was not merely the end of British rule. It was the end of an entire historical era that had begun before writing, before recorded history, before the island had a name. It was the moment, perhaps the first moment in the island's entire human history, when the Maltese themselves were genuinely, unambiguously, and entirely in charge of the place their ancestors had lived and built, and prayed and fought and died on for 7 millennia. That is not a small thing. That is by any measure one of the most significant moments in the entire story we have been following across this long night. What came next was a period of carefully managed neutrality. Malta declared itself a neutral and non-aligned state, refusing to join NATO or any military alliance, pursuing a foreign policy that emphasized its role as a bridge between Europe and the Arab world, between North and South. Mintoff cultivated relationships with Gaddafi's Libya, with various Arab states, and with the non-aligned movement, a set of diplomatic choices that were controversial both domestically and internationally, but that reflected a genuine conviction that Malta's strategic position, which had always been defined by its location between different worlds, might now be used for purposes of mediation and dialogue rather than military power. In 1980, Malta's neutrality was enshrined in the Constitution, an extraordinary legal step, giving constitutional protection to the foreign policy stance of a sovereign nation in a way that is still relatively unusual in the world. Malta committed itself to never hosting foreign military forces, never allowing its territory to be used as a base for military operations, and to maintaining and developing its role as a centre for international dialogue and peace promotion. The end of the Cold War in 1989 and 1991 brought new possibilities and new pressures. With the Soviet-American standoff that had structured European politics for 40 years suddenly dissolving, the question of where a small Mediterranean island nation fit in the emerging European order became urgent. After considerable debate and a referendum campaign, Malta became a member of the European Union in May 2004 and adopted the euro in January 2008. European Union membership has transformed Malta in ways that are still unfolding. The island's economy has diversified dramatically, moving away from dependence on the dockyard and military spending toward tourism, financial services, digital gaming, film production. The island's dramatic landscapes and architecture have made it a popular film location, with major productions including several episodes of Game of Thrones shot on its streets and in its fortifications, and most recently a growing sector in blockchain and cryptocurrency-related financial services. The population of Malta has grown from roughly 300,000 at independence to around 500,000 today, a significant portion of which consists of migrants and expatriates drawn by the island's EU membership, its English-language environment, and its Mediterranean climate. This demographic transformation is creating new conversations about Maltese identity, about what it means to be Maltese in a world where the island is simultaneously a small European country, a Mediterranean crossroads, a tourist destination, and an international financial centre. And through all of this, through the EU meetings and the film sets and the financial regulations and the tourist hotels built on the limestone cliffs, the old strategic question persists in transformed but recognisable form. Malta still sits at the centre of the Mediterranean. The passage between east and west still runs through its waters. The island is still a pivot point for movement, commerce, and the flow of information and people across the sea that connects 3 continents. Today, that flow includes the largest movement of people across the Mediterranean since the ancient world, the wave of migration from sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East that has been building since the 1990s and reached its peak crisis years in 2015 and 2016, when hundreds of thousands of people attempted the dangerous crossing from Libya to the European shores of Malta, Sicily, and the Italian mainland. Malta, by virtue of its position, and its maritime search and rescue obligations under international law, has been disproportionately affected by this migration crisis, and the island's small size has made the political and humanitarian challenges proportionally enormous. The question of what Malta owes to those who cross the water in small boats, the question of shelter, of refuge, of safety, connects with an almost poetic symmetry to the very etymology of the island's name, Maleth, shelter, the place of refuge, the name the Phoenicians gave to this island 3,000 years ago, when they saw its harbours opening like arms in the limestone cliffs, when they recognised in its geography the possibility of safety in a dangerous sea. The irony is not lost on the Maltese themselves, an island that was fought over for millennia precisely because of its strategic position, whose value was always measured in terms of military advantage, of controlling the passage between east and west, now finds itself asked to embody a completely different kind of value, the value of welcome, of safety, of the harbour that opens rather than the gate that closes. The generals who argued over Malta across the centuries thought of it as a weapon. The people crossing the water today are not thinking about strategy, they are thinking about survival, they are thinking about what lies behind them, the violence, the poverty, the collapsing states and burning cities, and what might lie ahead. And the name of the island they are heading, toward or past, has always meant the same thing: shelter, refuge, a place where the dangerous sea might be survived. Whether the island can live up to that name, whether a small nation of 500,000 people, with its own pressures and politics and internal debates, can find a way to honour the deepest meaning of its own ancient name, is one of the questions that Malta carries into the future, alongside all the others that its long and layered history has accumulated. It is a question that connects the present to the deep past in exactly the kind of unexpected, resonant way that Malta's history constantly produces. The Phoenician sailors who named the island for refuge could not have imagined the world in which that name would be tested 3 millennia later. But they gave the island the right name for a reason, and the reason has not gone away. The name has never stopped being true. As you lie here in the quiet, letting the long story of this extraordinary island settle over you like the stone settling on its ancient seabed, it is worth pausing on a thought that Malta's history offers with particular clarity. The story of Malta is, at its deepest level, the story of geography as destiny. Every civilization that looked at those 300 square kilometres of limestone and scrubland and deep harbours arrived at the same conclusion. This place matters, this place is necessary, this place cannot be ignored. The Phoenician traders who needed a safe harbour between east and west, the Carthaginian admirals who needed a forward base to threaten Sicily, the Roman generals who understood that control of the central Mediterranean meant control of trade and power, the knights who fought their hopeless, magnificent siege against the full might of the Ottoman Empire, Napoleon, who took the island in 2 days and considered it worth more than all of Italy, the British admirals for whom it was the master key to the Mediterranean Empire, the Luftwaffe, planners who recognised that it had to be destroyed or neutralised if Rommel was to be fed and fuelled in the North African desert. They were all responding to the same fact, that Malta occupies a position in the Mediterranean that geography made, that no human decision created, and that no human decision can change. The island sits where it sits, and the sea runs where it runs, and the consequences of that arrangement have been playing out for 7,000 years, through civilizations whose names we barely remember, and civilizations whose marks are still visible on every stone wall and every street of Valletta. But the story of Malta is not only a story about geography, or about the great powers and their calculations. It is also a story about the people who lived on this island through all of those millennia, the Neolithic temple builders whose names we will never know, and whose religion we will never fully understand, but who moved 50-ton stones with their bare hands and built chambers that spoke in the voice of gods. The Punic farmers and fishermen whose language survives, impossibly, in the mouths of modern Maltese. The medieval Maltese who refused to be absorbed or erased by Arab or Norman or Spanish or Hospitaller overlords, who preserved something essential and irreducible about their own identity through every change of masters. The men who reinforced Fort St. Elmo in small boats in the darkness of 1565, crossing a harbour controlled by the Ottoman fleet to join a garrison that had no reasonable hope of survival. The families who lived underground in the limestone tunnels of 1942, listening to the bombs falling above them, continuing to pray and to cook and to look after their children and their old people and their neighbours, continuing to be Maltese under circumstances that would have broken most communities. What the Maltese have demonstrated across 7,000 years and on 300 square kilometres of limestone is something about the relationship between place and people that is not always easy to articulate, but that is deeply felt by anyone who has spent time on the island. The place made the people, in the obvious sense that the island's position determined its history, and the history determined the character of its inhabitants. But the people also made the place, poured themselves into it, built it, decorated it, defended it, grieved over it, and loved it with a specificity and passion that is visible in every carved stone and painted ceiling and harbour fortification. The temples at Hagar-Kim and Gantija still stand on their limestone ridges, looking out over the sea that surrounded them 5,500 years ago, the same sea that the Phoenician traders crossed, that Paul's grain ship was driven across by the northeastern gale, that the Ottoman fleet sailed across in 1565, that the convoys of 1942 fought through. The sea has not changed, the geometry of the island has not changed. What has changed, again and again, is the human drama that has played out against that unchanging backdrop. The languages spoken, the gods prayed to, the flags flown from the battlements, the technologies of trade and war that successive civilizations brought to these shores, and the sleeping lady still lies in her display case in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, the small clay figure from the Hippogeum, reclining on her side, utterly peaceful, face turned slightly downward, absorbed in her dream or her trance or her eternal sleep, having witnessed, from her stone case, all the centuries that have passed since the hands that made her were dust. She was created by someone who lived on this island before history had a name, before writing, before metal, before the Mediterranean had been mapped or named or divided up among civilizations. She was created in an age that we can access only through fragments and guesses and the silent eloquence of stones, and yet she does not feel ancient. She feels present. She feels as if she might at any moment open her eyes. That is what Malta does. It collapses time. It brings the deep past into vivid proximity with the present. It makes the distance between the Neolithic and the modern feel permeable, the way the limestone of the island itself is permeable, shot through with tunnels and caves and underground chambers, full of hidden spaces and echoing passages that connect the surface to what lies below. The great harbour of Valletta, where the Phoenician traders anchored their ships, and the knights built their galleys, and the British maintained their battleships, and the convoys fought their way through, in the bombs and fire of 1942 still opens its arms to the sea. The limestone bastions still stand. The baroque streets of Valletta, named for a man who was 70 years old when he stood in the breach and refused to give way, still run from the city gate to the old fort at the peninsula's tip. The Church of St. John still holds Caravaggio's painting where the artist signed his name in blood. And somewhere below the surface of all of this, below the tourist cafes and the EU administrative offices and the yachts in the marina and the film crews on the streets, the story continues. The story of a small island in a great sea, a place whose value was written into its geography before any human being ever set foot on its shores, a place that has been fought over and built up and bombed and rebuilt and settled and resettled and named and renamed across more human generations than most countries can even claim to remember. The key to the Mediterranean. That was what they called it. The generals and the admirals and the strategists across the centuries. The key to the Mediterranean. But perhaps that framing is too cold, too strategic, too much the language of command and conquest. Perhaps the better way to think about Malta is not as a key, an instrument for opening things, a tool, but as a hinge, the place where two halves of a great story connect, where East meets West, where ancient meets modern, where the depths of prehistory surface into the brightness of the present. The hinge of the Mediterranean world, swinging open across 7,000 years of human life. Consider for a moment what it means that all of this history happened on 300 square kilometres of limestone. The entire island of Malta is smaller than many individual cities. You can drive from one end to the other in under an hour, and yet within that small space, within those modest dimensions, the entire arc of Mediterranean civilization has played out in miniature. Every great empire, every major religion, every transformation in the technology of war and commerce and governance has left its mark on this island, layer upon layer upon layer, like the geological strata in the limestone cliffs themselves, each era deposited on top of the one before it, all of them still present, all of them still legible to anyone who looks carefully enough. That compression, the way Malta packs the full weight of human history into a space you can walk across in a day, is part of what makes the island so extraordinary and so strange. It teaches you something that large countries, with their wide spaces and their ability to lose things in their own vastness, cannot quite teach. That history is not something that happens somewhere else, to other people, in places too distant to matter. History is what happens to a specific patch of ground, to the people who live on it, and the people who want it, and the people who built the walls and dug the tunnels and buried their dead and left their marks in the stone. Malta has no vastness to hide in, no distance to make things abstract. Every century of its story is within walking distance. Every layer of its past is underfoot. The limestone is warm from the sun of millennia. The harbours are deep and still. The sea breathes softly against the cliffs. Somewhere out there, in the blue dark water between Malta and the invisible coast of Africa, the shoals where Paul's grain ship ran aground are still there, somewhere below the surface, silent, unremarkable, a patch of sandy bottom and scattered rock that changed the course of the world's largest religion without anyone planning it, without anyone knowing, without any grand strategic calculation. Just a ship driven off course by a storm and a man who shook a snake off his hand into a fire and refused to die. Malta, the shelter, the refuge, the key that opens the middle of the world. Let that image settle gently now as the story finds its resting place. The ancient sea, the limestone island, the long procession of civilizations across the water, the temples that no one remembers building, the harbour that everyone wanted, the people who endured everything and forgot nothing,